Hello, dear students. Greetings from Multifarnham, County Westmeath. I have prepared for you today a brief video, or at least I think it's going to be somewhat brief, with an introduction to Foucault's History of Sexuality, Volume 1. As you know, this is the book, or perhaps it's going to be one of the books, we're going to see how much we're going to be able to cover. As you know, this is going to be one of the books that we're going to read in the second half of the semester. Now again, as you know, the second half of the semester is going to be quite different from the first half, but perhaps in interesting ways. I mean, I am myself curious, I have to say, whether it is to find out whether it is possible and how it is possible to teach philosophy in an online format. I'm going to try to some extent to replicate the class format of lectures and then discussion and questions. And so I would like to encourage you to use the discussion forum on Moodle to make remarks about the text we're going to read, ask questions, by the way, not only of me, but also of each other. But it's an experiment, so we'll have to see how it all goes, and I would also like to encourage you to give me feedback, not only on Foucault and whether what I said about Foucault was clear, whether you have additional questions, but please also give me feedback on how you feel about, let's say, these recorded videos, whether they're helpful, or do feel free to make suggestions regarding even kind of, technological improvements, as we are trying to get through this second half of the semester in as interesting and productive a way as possible. So, a good way to introduce Foucault's History of Sexuality is, of course, to make a connection with the text that we just completed reading, Heidegger's Question Concerning Technology. And there are important connections. Why are there important connections? I would say for two reasons. Or perhaps just one, let me think. Perhaps the most important reason is that Foucault was an avid reader of and fan of Heidegger's. So it wouldn't be surprising, therefore, to find Heideggerian ideas in Foucault. Likewise, so perhaps there is a second reason, likewise, there are certain trends and currents in contemporary philosophy that we've already encountered in Heidegger, which we will find in Foucault as well. And so therefore, again, approaching Foucault against the background of the Heidegger essay which we just read is not a bad idea. So let me have a look at the Heidegger essay here and remind you of an important aspect of the opening paragraph. In the opening paragraph, Heidegger talks about the need to establish a free relationship to technology. And we've talked about what that may mean in a number of different dimensions. Free relationship of technology is something that we need because we live in a world in which we're increasingly dominated by technology. So according to Heidegger, what does it mean to, ultimately what it means to establish a free relationship with technology is something that emerges at the end of the essay, and which we've discussed. But just taking into consideration this, or just reading this first paragraph, let us remind ourselves of Heidegger's emphasis on the importance of becoming free in relation to technology. On page 217 in the first paragraph, Heidegger writes this: "We shall be questioning technology, and in so doing, we should like to prepare a free relationship to it. The relationship will be free if it opens our human existence to the essence of technology. When we can respond to this essence, we shall be able to experience the technological within its own bounds." So, the project of exploring the possibility of freedom, which Heidegger emphasizes so strongly in this introductory paragraph, is Foucault's project as well. Foucault's work is about freedom. How can we be free? How is it possible to be free, given the multiple ways in which contemporary philosophy, but also sociology, economics, psychology, and various other disciplines, how can we be free given the discovery that's been made in a number of disciplines of the radical finitude of human existence? Finitude, finiteness. In our class, I brought up a number of times the term of throneness, which is a wonderful telling term that Heidegger uses. We are thrown into this world without having been asked. I was not asked to be born. I was not asked to be born German. I was not asked to be born a man. I was not asked to be born, with a certain height, with certain physical strength, and with certain physical limitations, etc., etc. I was also not. I didn't ask to be born in a particular political situation. I wasn't asked. I didn't ask. I wasn't asked whether I wanted to be born into the political situation of the late 20th and then the 21st century, etc., etc. I think you get the point. So, given these multiple limitations of the human being, again, this thrownness, this finitude, given the stark ways in which, in the contemporary world, our limitations have been emphasized, perhaps not the contemporary world, in contemporary branches of knowledge, in particular the humanities, how can we be free? That's Foucault's question also. How is freedom possible? I'll give you, in order to illustrate this point, I'll give you what I think is a very strong and interesting quotation from Foucault. Foucault writes, "Maybe the target today is to refuse what we are and to imagine and build up what we could be." Maybe the target today is to refuse what we are and to imagine and build up what we could be. Now, in this attempt to imagine ourselves differently from the way in which we are as we find ourselves in the various limitations into which we have been thrown. In this task to imagine ourselves differently, history is key. Why is history key? Because without knowledge of history, we live in what one could call a one-dimensional reality without alternatives. And I will give you an example. As you know, I like to give you contemporary examples that one may hope show how philosophy is relevant to contemporary discussions and to the contemporary world. One example is human reactions to pandemics, to epidemics. How have human beings in the past reacted to pandemics? The most famous example perhaps is the Black Death in the Middle Ages. Why might it be useful to study this in the contemporary situation? Well, not so that we imitate how pandemics were addressed in the Middle Ages. They were probably addressed in a way that was totally unscientific and in many ways unsatisfactory. But in order to open our imagination up to the possibility of acting differently from the way in which we are currently acting. That's the point of the study of history. To open up possibilities for the future that come from knowledge of and a rethinking of the past in light of the insights that it might bring to the present situation. So that's what Foucault's work now. Foucault's work is not all about the coronavirus or about the Black Death. In fact, he doesn't talk about these things at all. But it's about this knowledge of history in order to free us to the possibility of reimagining our own present. That's what he does in all his works. So what he aims at is what one could call a deconstruction. I'm not sure if you know, but I have a number of times mentioned this important term of contemporary philosophy, a deconstruction, that is to say an unbuilding. That's what literally or etymologically deconstruction means. Foucault aims at an unbuilding of the assumptions, of many assumptions, that we take for granted in the contemporary world and on which our contemporary life is based. The philosopher wants to question these assumptions in order to show where they come from historically, but also in order to ask whether the assumptions should really be taken for granted or whether there are perhaps alternatives to them. And I think you can already see how this approach frees us to think differently, to react differently, to live differently in the contemporary world. Foucault, I'll give you a few examples of this approach that Foucault uses. I'll briefly talk about a few of his works, some of the most famous ones, preceding the history of sexuality, and I'm going to do this in order to give you an idea, a more concrete idea of Foucault's method and approach. Foucault's first major book, not his first book, but his first major book, and a book that rendered him famous at a fairly young age, is called History of Madness, or in an earlier translation, Madness and Civilization. If you go, I wanted to say if you go to the library, well, obviously I think you're not going to go to the library, so if you go on the internet and look for this title, you will find that it appears there under two different titles. Madness and Civilization is the first English translation of what in French is called Histoire de la Folie. And the first English translation is heavily abridged. It's if you do get to see a physical copy, you will find that it's a kind of slim volume of 200 pages or so. Whereas the French original edition is this huge tome. So therefore, just recently, in the last 10 years or so, the Histoire de la Folie was retranslated as History of Madness. So anyway, so don't be confused if you find two different titles for this work. The one is an abridged version, the other one is the English is the full English translation of the French original. History of Madness. In some ways, you know, it's perhaps Foucault's most fundamental philosophical work, although that's, you know, if I were to think about this statement I just made, I would probably have to revise it in some ways. But it's a very, very interesting work, and you will see from my brief characterization in a minute why that is so. In History of Madness, Foucault shows how our conception of what it means to be rational is intrinsically and dialectically linked to our understanding of that which is not rational, in other words, madness. Normally in the contemporary world, we would divide rationality and madness from each other very rigidly. We would assume that either you're a rational person or you're mad. And if you're mad, you, well, need to be treated in the hospital, or perhaps you need to be given medication. There is a rigid and rigorous distinction between reason and madness. Foucault would say the rational human being and the mad human being do not talk to each other. If now I started raving wildly in front of the camera, more crazily than I'm already raving, if this started happening, well, you would be very, very confused, and you would turn the video off, and you would say, well, you know, Professor Roseman needs to go to the clinic. You know, he obviously has some problem. He's no longer talking intelligibly, but he's saying all kinds of nonsense. If you go back a few hundred years, in such a situation, where someone started talking, screaming, talking, raving, saying unintelligible things, the reaction would have been very different. The reaction would have been, aha, so that's a voice I don't understand. So what kind of message is it sending? So you see immediately the reaction wouldn't have been, this is simply nonsense. The person has to be shut off in some way by being segregated into a clinic or by being administered pills. But the reaction would have been, this is a voice that I don't understand. And since I don't understand it, well, perhaps it's saying something not necessarily that is beneath reason, but perhaps something that's above reason. Or that at any rate I have to try to, perhaps it contains a message that I have to decipher in some way. What kind of message could that be? It could be a prophetic message. Perhaps I have knowledge so deep in my mental, not really confusion, in this somewhat deranged state. Perhaps I have knowledge so deep to communicate that one needs to listen to it particularly carefully. Another possibility is that I speak unintelligibly and scream and rave because I'm possessed by a demonic force. So, but at any rate, you see, Foucault shows in this work that he tries to write the history of the segregation between the so-called rational person and the so-called mad person, uncovering through three historical stages which he distinguishes, uncovering a different way of reacting to madness, which is not simply shutting the so-called mad person up. And I think you can already see the approach, and this then has contemporary implications for understanding of what reason itself is. So is reason this thing which is completely closed off from madness, or is there perhaps a dimension of madness within reason, to which reason should actually be listening? In this context, think of Nietzsche. Nietzsche, certainly towards the end of his life, was mad. Now, we can't go into the medical and psychiatric diagnosis of Nietzsche, but he was mad in some way. Does that mean that he's no longer worth reading as a philosopher? Does that mean that he has nothing worthwhile to say as a philosopher? Or does this perhaps give a particular depth to his, in the end, raving stuff? He started, speaking rather, in a wild and uncontrolled way, and his works become more and more extreme, with titles such as The Antichrist and so forth. What exactly does that mean for Nietzsche's work? And by the way, Foucault, the History of Madness, in the introduction to the History of Madness, which, if you're interested, it would be worth reading. Foucault, by the way, is a great writer. Foucault knows how to write, just like Nietzsche. And like Heidegger, just not in the English translation. In the introduction to the History of Madness, Foucault talks about the way in which his entire philosophical project stands under the great sun of the Nietzschean oeuvre. So Foucault is certainly a philosopher who works in the wake of Nietzsche. So that was just these were just a few quick remarks about the History of Madness. Another work in which Foucault deconstructs contemporary ways of living and of thinking by showing where they have come from historically. Another work along those lines is Discipline and Punish, in which Foucault shows the historical evolution and the origins of the current practice of punishing people by means of incarceration, which we now take for granted. Someone commits a crime, now let's not talk about the most horrible crimes, let's talk about something relatively petty. Somebody steals a significant amount of money. Well, if the amount of money is sufficiently large, the person will be incarcerated for a few months, for a few years, whatever. Why is that an appropriate form of punishment? To put this person into a cell, in some government building that's designated as a jail or a prison. Well, in the Middle Ages, prisons did not exist. Prisons only existed to hold people, to get them ready for trial, and then, of course, to punish them, which meant torture them in public. Now you will say, are we going to return to that? No, that's not what Foucault advocates. But he is interested in the question of how we got to take it for granted that our current practices of punishment are appropriate. Foucault himself, among the various political initiatives that he took during his life, was an advocate of prison reform in France. All right, I took a brief break there because talking to a camera actually requires quite a bit of concentration, more than I thought. So I just had to, step away for a second and get a breath of fresh air. So now I turn to this book, The History of Sexuality, an introduction, or Volume 1, an introduction. Please do, I can only emphasize it again, I've said it a number of times about the Heidegger essay, please do get yourselves a copy of this book. As you can see, it's a slim book, there you see. Let me see how many pages it has. It has 168 pages, it's a short book, it's not an expensive book, it's a book that gets read in many universities all over the world. It's very, very famous. It gets read in philosophy classes, sociology classes, literature classes. So you will find used copies all over the internet for probably just a couple of euros. Please buy it and start reading, because otherwise the second half of the class is not going to be fruitful for you. You're not going to be able to do much with the study questions that I'm going to post, and of course you're not going to be able to contribute to our discussion either, because you will not know what we're talking about. So, History of Sexuality, Volume 1. So now, of course, think about this work against the background of what I just said, by way of introduction. Let me start by making a few remarks about the word, the history of sexuality. History. Sexuality has a history. So the idea behind that is that the way in which we not only think about our sexuality, but live our sexuality, is not something that that has been unchanged throughout the history of the human race. We may, for example, make the assumption that for as long as there have been human beings who were gay, straight, trans, bi, questioning, or to use, or who categorize themselves using one of the categories that now have come to be common in contemporary sexual discourse. Well, that's not the case. These are categories that were invented recently, as Foucault shows in the book, in the 19th century. So this then of course means, well, what does it mean? It means that a fundamental way in which we have come to take it for granted that our personality is structured is a recent invention. We have taken it for granted that it's very, very important for us to know whether we are straight or gay or trans or bi or etc., using one of these categories. It's very, very important for each of us to find out as we grow up, or sometimes even as we get older, in which of these categories we belong, and then also to come out, as the term is. That is to say, to let everyone know that we have now found out that we belong to one of these categories. Why is that so? What are the historical developments which have led us to constitute our personality in this way? That's the question that Foucault asks in the History of Sexuality, which, by the way, became a 4-volume work in which Foucault's own thought evolves very considerably. The 4th volume of the History of Sexuality appeared only recently, posthumously, after Foucault's death, and Foucault actually had ordered what's the word? Those administering, those who were responsible for his leftovers, for his writings, etc., after his death, he had asked for works that hadn't been published during his lifetime not to be published after his death, which means that normally the 4th volume of the History of Sexuality should never have appeared. He didn't want it to be published. Not that it contains anything horrible or terribly embarrassing, not at all. He just felt that works which he hadn't had a chance to complete to his own satisfaction shouldn't appear. Well, as you know, perhaps from the story of many other authors, typically then posterity disregards those kinds of instructions. So Foucault's those responsible for Foucault's works respected his request for a number of years, and then they just gave in to this desire to find out what he had to say in the 4th volume of the History of Sexuality. The one interesting thing about the 4th volume is that in the 4th volume he ends up studying the fathers of the Catholic Church. So that's certainly quite interesting. But that would be a different discussion. Why does he do this? How does he get to that point? Is a different discussion. Volume 1 doesn't have this emphasis at all, though there is a point which we're going to discover where something very Catholic becomes very important for Foucault's argument, and that is confession. And we'll get to that, well, in a week or two when we reach that point in the History of Sexuality. So, where has this way of constituting our personality sexually come from? What are the historical conditions that have given rise to it? But then, of course, also along the lines that I indicated earlier in this video lecture, do we have to constitute ourselves, our personality in this way? What are the alternatives? That's that's the question which Foucault asked in the History of Sexuality. Another brief remark on the word the history of sexuality. It goes back and perhaps just reminds you of a point that I've made a number of times in our physical classes when we were able to meet face to face. The category of history wasn't always an extremely important category in the, intellectual history of Western civilization. So if you take ancient thinkers, let's say Plato and Aristotle, but also if you take medieval thinkers like Thomas Aquinas, these are not thinkers who were hugely interested in history. History became a major philosophical category in the 19th century, when the importance of history was also discovered in other disciplines. You could say that the 19th century was the century of the discovery of history. In philosophy, the great discoverer of the importance of history was, of course, Hegel, with his idea according to which history is not simply a succession of contingent events, but is the unfolding of being and perhaps even of God himself. Don't know how much of Hegel you've studied, so I'm not going to get into much more detail now. In Hegel, history comes to be intrinsically connected with being and truth and even with God. Even God has a history, according to Hegel. Another field in which history became very important in the 19th century is, of course, biology. Think of Darwin. Before Darwin, the assumption was that the various genera and species of living things were eternal, that there was an eternal essence of the human being and an eternal essence of the acorn, of the oak tree, and an eternal essence of the doggy and the cat, etc., etc. Now, Darwin's theory is that there is no such thing as an historically unchangeable essence of cat. Cat has come from some other form of existence. We all evolved from, ultimately bacteria and viruses and slime or something like that. So even our biological being has a history. And then, as just one further example, I'm not being exhaustive here, but as one further example, the 19th century is also the century of the discovery of history as a branch of knowledge. History becomes I'm not sure that was completely correct. It's the discovery of history as a methodologically structured, rigorous discipline. That's what happens in the 19th century. In the 19th century, for example, universities start teaching history. If you go to a medieval university, and of course the origins of the university are medieval, you wouldn't find any study of history there. And the foundation of history as an academic discipline is associated with, of course, another very important and famous and brilliant German, Leopold von Ranke. Also, in this context of thinking about the relationship between philosophy of history, it may be useful that we remind ourselves of Heidegger's use in the essay The Question Concerning Technology of the category of destiny. At the end of the last face-to-face class that we were able to have, a group of students, just 3 or 4 people, asked me afterwards, "My gosh, what does this destining stuff mean? That's such a difficult category." And I try to respond. Destining at the end, it's of course one of Heidegger's strange terms, or one of those terms that appear particularly strange in English translation. At the end of the day, destining is not that difficult to understand. It means the historical processes in which being reveals or unconceals itself in different ways depending on the historical epoch or period in which one finds oneself. So Heidegger is very Hegelian in this regard. That is to say, Heidegger believes that being itself has a history. Not exactly in Hegel's sense, but being has a history. Ultimately, it's historical process which determines how being unfolds. In our time, as you know, according to Heidegger, it unfolds technologically. Foucault applies this idea of historical unfolding to the notion of sexuality. Okay, so look, this was my brief introduction to Volume 1 of the History of Sexuality. As I said, I hope that you'll give me some feedback. Let me know if the video was helpful. For example, it could be that seeing my face here could be a distraction, so I could start making podcasts. Again, we're going to use the discussion forum. Do feel free to make suggestions on what you consider to be the best ways technologically to structure the second half of the semester. I'll give you your assignment now for class on Friday. The assignment is to do some basic online reading on Foucault. I didn't in this introduction talk about Foucault's life, for example. Just have a look, let's say, at the Wikipedia article to get a basic idea of when the man was born and when he died, and where he taught and what his academic career was like, and you'll be able to read there also about some of his major works, beyond perhaps or in addition to what I said in this introductory video. Your assignment for Friday is also to read not very much at all, just part 1 of the work. The work for the History of Sexuality, the first volume of the History of Sexuality, has 5 parts of varying length. The first part is very, very short. It's entitled We Other Victorians, and it starts on page 3 and goes on to page 13. So your assignment for Friday is just to read about 10 pages. What I'm going to do in the course of the week is formulate a few study questions. Given the fact that it's not a lot of text, there are not going to be a lot of study questions, so perhaps I'll just ask 5 or 6 questions. These are going to guide you in your reading. And then what I'm going to do for the class on Friday is something I'm still thinking about. And again, it depends a little bit on your feedback. I could post another video, or if you've already asked questions about the text, I could post responses to those questions in the discussion forum. We'll see how it all goes. Thank you very much for listening to this video. I hope you're doing well in the current circumstances, and I look forward to the second half of the class. All the best now. Bye-bye.